For joining us today here at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. My name is Asmaret Eskedom, and I'm the Associate Deputy Director of the Center, and I'll be moderating the lecture today. It's a pleasure to welcome our speaker, the former Undersecretary of Energy, Paul Dabbar. His lecture is entitled U.S. Energy Superpower Status and a New Energy Diplomacy, and it's based on a paper he published this year at the Hoover Institution. His lecture will take us through the history of U.S. energy diplomacy and recount how the U.S. has become an energy superpower. He'll also provide insights into how the U.S. can maintain that status moving forward and how it can maximize U.S. and ally energy security. His lecture comes at an important time for energy security as efforts to transition to predominantly low carbon fuels have highlighted both technical and national security challenges. We here at CGSR took on this topic and published a paper in August of last year on energy issues, which you can find on our website. Former Undersecretary Dabbar has decades of experience working on energy, emerging technologies, and national defense. He is currently a co-founder and CEO of Dabbar Quantum Technology, a senior research scholar at Columbia University, and a board member at Dominion Energy and Montana Technologies. From 2017 to 2021, Paul served as the Department of Energy's fourth Undersecretary for Science. In terms of today's format, our speaker will spend about 30 to 45 minutes giving his lecture. Then we'll head right into the Q&A session with the audience. Feel free to start raising your hands electronically and writing questions into the chat during the lecture. That way we can just jump right into the Q&A portion. With that said, Paul, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our lecture series. Thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Asmaret, thank you very much. It was always enjoyable for my multiple visits, both while Undersecretary and subsequent to being Undersecretary at Lawrence Livermore, and the strategy component, the Center for National Security at Livermore, obviously is an important voice for various people who are writing and talking about what's going on, and obviously being a Department of Energy lab, I think it's particularly topical for the paper that I published at Hoover that I'll go through today, which is what has changed from the energy posture of the United States in the last generation, and what that means going forward, in particular for diplomacy. Energy diplomacy many times is not kind of widely discussed in the sector, but if you're in government, and certainly if you're a big international companies or deal with equipment or commodities that are international, it's an everyday part of your life. So things have changed incredibly dramatically in the last 20 years. And so I'll be starting to go through that and then talk about some of these implications that have happened in the short term that people may not be fully aware of, and to talk about potential energy diplomacy changes as a result of these recent changes. So as I mentioned, the U.S. energy posture has dramatically shifted. If you look at the U.S. went from the largest energy importer in the world, and the bottom of that was in 2004, and it started shifting an upward slope or a reduction in energy imports around then. And in 2019, the U.S. hit the net energy exporter status. That was a primary goal of President Jimmy Carter when he stood up DOE and started driving energy policy for the country on the back of the 73 Arab-Israeli war and the embargo. And, there's been some kind of humorous pieces done in the past on things like the Comedy Channel about how every president has said we're gonna be energy independent, or we're gonna be no longer an exporter, and president after president kind of said it, and then finally it happened, and it kind of snuck up on people, and it occurred right before the COVID hit. So it was kind of lost by many people of what exactly happened. Well, not only since 2019 did we hit the U.S. hit a net export status, the U.S. is now the largest energy exporter in the world, which is further extended that kind of status. So if you do a calculation on a BOE basis or a BTU basis, U.S. is now the largest exporter of energy. So what an incredibly dramatic turnaround from being the largest energy importer. U.S. As a subset of that is the largest producer of both oil and gas. I was talking with a leader in the energy sector, and we were talking about Saudi Arabia, and I said, well, Saudi Arabia is obviously very important for oil. They're the number 2 producer of oil in the world. And even that leader in the industry said, it's just amazing that you could say that. And that's the fact, the current facts of where the worlds are. Clearly, the U.S. is a leader in the discovery of new energy technologies. That was a primary area of mine as undersecretary and the National Lab Complex, inventing new energy technologies from the discovery side. And it's not just, not just at the DOE National Labs, but universities all over the United States funding small grants in chemistry and other things that periodically spit out something that's amazing. And we clearly drive discovery science overall for the world, but in particular also for energy topics. The U.S. is clearly a manufacturing leader in some areas. It's not maybe the ones that people talk about as much, but if you look at the totality, clearly in oil and gas equipment, which is called oil field services, U.S. is clearly a leader in that. Turbine equipment, so you look at gas turbines, wind turbines, steam turbines. The U.S. still has very large manufacturing for that sort of equipment. Certainly a lot of other electronics dealing with transmission and so on. Still a lot of manufacturing done in the U.S. And obviously cars, which people kind of generally put in that bucket. Certainly the IC engine side, the U.S. is extremely strong, and EV side. Well, Tesla was our first major company. It's a U.S. company, does import a number of components, but it's a U.S. company, and obviously other car companies too expanding. So there's certain portions of the manufacturing space where U.S. is not a leader in, but and trying to expand. And then the last one, which is a dominant area that you need to be in the area of finance many times to notice, the U.S. dominates capital raising. The second largest market for capital raising is London, is the UK, at 10% of the size of the United States. Not just the public equity markets and the public debt markets, but the venture capital markets, the private equity markets, the infrastructure. U.S. dominates capital raising, including for the energy sector. So if you look at the totality of that, it's extremely clear the U.S. is the global energy superpower. No other country comes close to that combination. Not Saudi Arabia, not China, not Russia. No one comes close to this list. And I think a lot of people don't have awareness of what's happened in terms of that totality. So how did that happen? I mean, a lot of people don't even realize that happened. So how did it happen? If you look at the kind of the combination of what it's been able to do, given that kind of improved energy posture I just raised. So the U.S. is obviously a global leader in increasing energy production. So if you look at BTUs or BOE calculations, if you look at how much energy is produced in the world, and which country it's coming from, the U.S. has dominated the addition of additional energy production in the world over the last 20 years. The U.S. actually generated energy price deflation driven by technology innovation. This is a long topic, but if you look at most of the energy types, energy deflation was kind of the norm up until around 2021. And why is that? It's because of technology innovation. So clearly, drilling technologies drove down the cost of oil and natural gas. There's lots of charts that show the lifting costs in the Permian Basin dropping every year after year after year in the mid-teens. And even still to this day, this is the ability to kind of drive energy deflation from that point of view is generally continuing. But the same thing from wind, same thing from solar. If you look at solar production costs 20 years ago, it wasn't even commercial in around 2000. But it dropped depending on where you looked at for solar, dropped anywhere from 90 to 99% reduction in cost for solar. Wind also because of various improvements. So those are just examples. The U.S. generated that due to innovation of those technologies. Now, the U.S. has led the world in the reduction of tons of emissions. People can look at lots of different metrics around emissions, but during that whole time frame, because of all those different drivers of new types of energy production that were reduced emissions, the U.S. has led the world in the reduction of tons of emissions. One could argue it should go faster, but the U.S. is clearly the world leader, certainly compared to China, and China's obviously by far the worst in this. China is increasing emissions by 3 times the rate of America's reductions. And so the world's still heading in the wrong direction, not because of America, but because of communist China. And then the U.S. has been the global leader of providing energy market stability and security. Obviously, the Ukraine war is an example of that, but I'll give a few examples of that here later in my talk. So a little bit of the history of energy diplomacy. This is my paper goes into it a little bit more. Obviously, in the kind of World War II, post-World War II, or pre-World War II, up to the OPEC oil embargo, it was really great power spheres of influence. So, for example, the French and the British tried to squeeze the U.S. out of certain countries under certain treaties, like the San Remo Agreement, trying to keep the U.S. out of certain countries that they had spheres of influence over, and so the U.S. went to other countries to partner with the locals. So the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the U.S. went to other places, and that kind of drove energy diplomacy for quite a while. Post World War II, one of the big diplomacy points was around nuclear power. The U.S. obviously invented nuclear power. And helped set up the IAEA and helped drive kind of global nuclear. That clearly was a dominant country in the world in terms of exporting nuclear power plants and the technologies around it for like GE and Westinghouse and Babcock and Wilcox. Over the course of time, the various oil countries decided to start asserting ownership. So Saudi Arabia, Iran, others wanted to own their own oil production, which was and nationalizations occurred in some instances, and so that was kind of the pre-73 energy diplomacy. Obviously, 73 was a very large disruption in the global energy markets. Crude oil was definitely the driver of that at the time, and therefore the OPEC oil embargo that increased prices by a little over 3 times. And put availability at risk due to political embargoes on the United States in this case. It caused a shift of global energy investment by U.S. entities in places like to the North Sea to diversify away from Gulf political risk, or Venezuela was another one. And refineries were built, bespoke refineries, for example, were built along Texas to primarily focus on Venezuelan crude to reduce the political engagement risk in the Middle East. But notwithstanding that, the U.S. got more engaged in the Middle East in some reasonable degree because of energy posture risk. And so Jimmy Carter even specifically said that he was very much trying to push the Egypt-Israeli peace treaty in part to tamp down risks in the Middle East, and in part because of energy exposure. The U.S. was increasingly getting exposure to in a negative way in terms of Middle East politics. And so during the course of time, the U.S. Energy posture was dropping as it was getting weaker over the course of time. Another area of energy weakness was the 3 Mile Island incident and reduced nuclear leadership. The U.S. drove global nuclear leadership in part because of the domestic construction and industry. It was able to kind of export and show leadership as a result of that. After the domestic industry came to a halt to a very large degree to build anything new, as a result of the TMI event, U.S. Global leadership in nuclear started slowly eroding. So there was a lot of energy posture and diplomacy kind of reduction strength that slowly happened over time. And I would argue the bottom of it was around 2001. It just reduced energy production, reduced diplomacy capability. So in 2001, there was a paper out of the White House talking about how weak the U.S. was. It advocated for all the above energy technology innovation, but it said it was never going to be likely to be very useful, other than slowing down the posture erosion. And it recommended the United States, for example, enter into higher degrees of diplomacy with Russia and Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, because we needed to import more energy. So that was the kind of the bottom. So what happened? How did we go from that to literally the energy superpower in the world today? So the three drivers, as I define it. The first one was energy technology advances. The U.S. blew through all sorts of new innovation. The second one was on good, all the above energy, bipartisan government policy. So for about 20 years, there was a series of bills that were passed, acts that were passed, that as I quote here on this on my paper slide here. The way I like to summarize the negotiations that took place in Congress is, if you give me my pro-supply policies, I'll give you your pro-supply policies. So everyone was, the bipartisan deals that were getting cut were all based on the topic of more supply, right? And so there was, for example, in the 2016 Act, an extension of the PTC and the ITCs for renewables. And the trade was we could export oil. We would lift the ban. In 2005, there was a delegation of authority for drilling approvals from the EPA to each state's EPA. So it allowed places like Texas and North Dakota and Ohio to have a different view than California, for example, on approvals for new technology drilling, which obviously was amazingly successful in terms of energy production increases. And then the last one, and this is quite interesting compared to what's going on right now, is that there was a very, very large increase in the capital to go invest in what was triggered by the two things up above from the private sector. So this was not government funding. This was the private sector seeing new technologies, seeing good bipartisan government policy, and throwing tremendous amounts of money from the private sector into construction and production. And so, we saw a 5 times increase in drilling capex. Obviously, if you look at EVs, it went from 0 to a much higher number. So that's an incredibly high percentage increase, so to speak. Same thing on wind, same thing on solar. Lithium-ion batteries was a science experiment, that was funded by DOE and NSF, that went from a science experiment to a giant industry. And the amount of capital that went into that was almost solely from the private sector, just kind of capitalizing on discovery science at the labs and in academia. And so where are we at here today? A few data points. So the U.S. is both the top producer of oil in the world and the top producer of natural gas. The U.S. is a top exporter of LNG in the world and the third largest exporter of oil. As I mentioned, the U.S. is not only the largest capital markets for investment, but the gap is widening. The U.S. dominance in capital raising is gapping out even wider than it was 5 years ago. And there's a lot of drivers for that, but the U.S. is driving the private sector, which is the vast majority of the spending in the energy sector. As I mentioned, basic research it continues to lead. Country is, I think, accelerating the innovation and commercialization of new energy technologies. The U.S. is clearly the place where not only new technologies are discovered, but people are trying it. People are trying new battery types like iron air or many other different things by far faster than any other country in the world. As I said, the manufacturing side is strong and increasing. and we talked about emissions and the deployment of new technologies. And so I want to give you an example of the first inklings of the shift in global power. These are some of for energy. So these are some examples that I like to say started happening in the mid teens. It started accelerating to the late teens and a little bit further. But one of I think the largest issues that I highlighted in my papers is it's hard to exert power if you want to exert the power, but you can't exert the power if you don't acknowledge that you actually have the power. And there's been a lack of awareness of the points I was just previously going through. But exactly what happened? What are some examples of how this shift, when it started happening, what were some examples of that? So the first one here is that OPEC tried to raise prices in 2015 by reducing production. They thought they could crush the United States and the new shale revolution by just kind of driving them into the ground by reducing prices and driving down U.S. investment and production increases. Well, it turned out that the U.S. private sector was able to continue to reduce costs, and instead of driving up prices, OPEC gave up market share to the U.S. in significant fashion. So once again, the U.S. went from about 4 million barrels a day of production to 13. So a 300% increase in production, basically taking market share from OPEC. And that's the first two bullet points here on this slide. Another example of U.S. energy superpower status and the impact on diplomacy and international was oil sanctions. The U.S. was able, for political reasons, various political reasons, to put oil embargoes on the sale of oil from Venezuela and Iran, and they did not impact the oil prices. Oil prices continued to drop during this time frame. And so the only way that was able to happen, that effectively the U.S. was able to reduce oil supply in the world from Venezuela and Iran and still have prices going down, was that the U.S. Energy production and exports more than filled up the gap. Another one was when Iran attacked the Saudi Aramco facilities in 2019 with drones. And during that time frame, they took out a number of large oil production sites in Saudi Arabia, and the oil prices, other than a blip over like 1 or 2 days, went back to exactly where it was because the market believed that the U.S. production could cover for Saudi production losses, up to the point where they were going to fix those facilities attacked by Iran. And so another example of the market having confidence and seeing that U.S. leadership in energy was there and it could stabilize the world. Another one was when the United States decided to move its embassy to Israel to Jerusalem. I have some firsthand familiarity of that discussion in the White House, and they were debating about what sort of reaction it might engender. And one of them was, well, is OPEC going to respond? And the conclusion was OPEC did not have the ability to retaliate against the U.S. For potentially moving our embassy because the U.S. Had gained so much domestic production of energy, and we were not in the same position as we were in 1973. A few more examples. In the late 2010s, the Central European countries like Poland, the Balts, Romania were afraid that Russia might try to use energy against them and or a war may happen. They asked for our help to help start building energy infrastructure, both importing as well as them building out domestic production capabilities to put them in a better energy posture position for themselves. And so we were able to do that. And those countries are actually in a much better position than Germany as a result of our and their efforts before the Ukraine war to be worried about a risk that ended up happening. Another entertaining one that I like to say is that there was a period of time where the U.S. was exporting natural gas to the Persian Gulf. which was Abu Dhabi, and it's a longer conversation. But the fact that the United States was exporting LNG to a Persian Gulf country could not have been seen, 15, 20 years ago as a prospect. U.S. was provided the stability to the global energy markets when COVID hit. There's a lot of history on this in the press, which you can look up. And we used the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to actually place excess oil that occurred. As a result of that, and this is something that I think most people didn't catch. I wrote about this. I write for the Wall Street Journal, so I wrote about this in an editorial a couple of years ago. In May of 2020, after we took the lead on stabilizing the crude markets during COVID, we got asked to join to permanently coordinate, which is effectively an invitation to join OPEC Plus. And we were asked by Saudi Arabia, we were asked by Russia to permanently coordinate with OPEC, aka effectively joining OPEC Plus. We turned it down, but the fact that we were asked to basically be a part of the OPEC machine is stunning. And we sat around the office going like, I can't believe this is that this is happening. And obviously it would not have happened when we were the largest energy importer in the world. Obviously, the U.S. is taking the lead on the Russia-Ukraine war in terms of providing replacement energy to Europe. And then the last one, which is also another stunning thing that just happened in December, is that the combined oil and gas production of the United States and Canada has now exceeded the combined production of natural gas and crude oil for the Persian Gulf. So North America is now the lead producer of oil and gas in the world. Which author Dan Jurgen called out as a very stunning shift. So that's kind of the what I call what has happened. Well, it's the history. So where do we go from here? This is a somewhat long list. The world is obviously very, very diverse in terms of its energy posture and energy interests. And so in my paper, I address kind of each of these diplomacy angles and how they should be, how U.S. energy diplomacy should have a different set of policies and engagement based on this significant shift of the U.S. to the, as I say, the energy superpower, not but the energy superpower for the reasons I just laid out. So the first one that I like to highlight is, as I was mentioning earlier, is an awareness, domestic awareness of U.S. energy leadership. I continue to testify before Congress. There are many members and many people in this country who think, for example, China is the global energy leader. And if you just look at the data, whether it's oil and gas production, technology, as I said, the deployment of new technologies, capital markets and investment, and a reasonable amount of the manufacturing in the U.S. clearly is way ahead of China. If you look at the percent of the energy market, it's the U.S. is on all the different aspects. The U.S. is clearly the leader. But most people think that the U.S. is weak. They're still kind of caught in the 2004 kind of view of the world, and don't really realize that there's actually power in this position. So you have to kind of start there to realize that that's the case. So that's the first one. The second one is there's clearly a list of domestic energy policies that can maximize diplomatic posture. This is also a very long topic. But our ability to increase and all the above energy policies and manufacturing associated with that, and our engagement with the world. If a goal here is to maximize our energy diplomacy strength, and you do it and all the above, clearly you could say that we would like to increase our ability to produce energy technologies of all types, and that's obviously been very topical. The ability to export those sort of technologies, support for that in terms of exporting, like the Exim Bank, or our engagement with the World Bank and others to do financing for that. Clearly, oil and gas exports as a leading producer in the world. to maximize our ability to do that, the ability to export that. That clearly gets into the LNG and LNG pause topic, where countries around the world very publicly have said, well, we're not certain we can trust the United States. So the energy posture has been a little bit weakened by some of that, some of that policy kind of review. Obviously, things like around nuclear power and other kind of technologies to maximize our strengths there, to rebuild our strength domestically on that would also help our international engagement. So there's a number of these things that can be done that would maximize our diplomatic posture. And once again, you don't have to look very far in the past to show how things worked very dramatically in terms of the posture change, as well as actually the initial inklings of American powers I was describing on the previous few pages. So that's kind of what I call setting the stage. The first two bullet points. We could still, we should be aware of our strengths, so that we know what we could do. And then the second one is, there's still some domestic energy policies that if we want to maximize our energy diplomacy strength to take. So moving beyond the kind of domestic side, what is the different engagement policies? Well, the first one, the first thing you have to, the engagement diplomatically around energy in the United States, you always start with Canada. The Canadian and the U.S. energy markets are massively intertwined by infrastructure, by ownership of companies. The power pools are actually the same across the border. So we actually wheel power back and forth and actually do dispatching and reliability cross border, car production. It's an extremely long list of integration between the U.S. and Canada. And so the first step, I think about concentric circles. Where's the obvious first diplomacy and global engagement and coordination? You start with Canada. And so there's all sorts of things. There's obviously also environmental policies that are reasonably consistent, even across different administrations between the U.S. and Canada, and obviously we have a trade treaty around that. The next one is clearly Mexico. Mexico has a bit more complexity because of its internal politics around energy. The crude business and Pemex is a core part of the politics, the very long part of the politics of Mexico. But the natural gas and the power sectors are a little bit more fluid and take more investment in Mexico. Mexico's more open to that. Mexico's in a really interesting place right now. I think it's in a multi-generation, 2-3 generation opportunity for growth in Mexico. The re-onshoring or onshoring production from communist China and other places, but primarily communist China, looking to build manufacturing plants into Mexico and utilize a free trade agreement for Mexico. This is an incredible opportunity for Mexico to grow. But one of the big problems with Mexico on that incredible opportunity for growth for them is primarily power. And as a result, natural gas to fund power or to fund industrial heat. The Mexicans do not have enough natural gas. They do not have enough power. They got plenty of crude oil. And so the integration prospects of the U.S. and Canada to help Mexico by building pipelines, by building power plants of all types, investing into Mexico for their big manufacturing increase that would end up exporting a lot of product to the United States is a synergy between the energy markets versus industrial manufacturing. There is a great opportunity for the U.S. and Canada to further engage with this great opportunity for both the United States, but also for Mexico. The next one is kind of a more bespoke point, but one of the interesting things is the U.S. and Canada, as I mentioned, are already larger than all of the Persian Gulf in terms of oil and gas production. But if you look at the third largest democratic country that produces oil or oil and gas is Norway. And Norway is also a member of NATO. They're very intertwined with the U.S. as well as Canada on national security. A lot of consistencies, investment. There's a lot of U.S. company investment in the North Sea for oil production. Norway does a lot in the U.S. on, for example, offshore wind, as they're trying to do that also. And so, one of the ideas I kind of map out is that creating what I call NAPEC, the North Atlantic Petroleum Exporting Countries Forum, for the U.S., Canada, and Norway to get together on a periodic basis, like a G3 of democratic energy exporting countries, and be an additional voice. In addition, kind of as a counterposition to OPEC, is something to consider. Is an idea to leverage the strength of the United States plus Canada, and then number 3, Norway. And it could be not only around oil and gas, but it'd be around other energy topics and certainly also environmental topics. The next one's obviously a big one, which is OPEC. Our engagement with OPEC already is, as I described, what happened in 2020, significantly different than when we were the largest importer in the world. OPEC now looks at us very, very differently, and many of the OPEC countries are investing in LNG exports, for example, in the United States. And so our engagement with OPEC, and in particular countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, is in a very, very different position. And one of the things I like to point out is that it's not just about oil. OPEC and the OPEC countries like Saudi Arabia have other things they care about. They care about maximizing profits for their budget. They care about expanding their economy beyond oil. They care about global engagement. They care about their own national security issues. It's a very challenging area of the world. And so our engagement with the OPEC countries, and in particular the Gulf countries that are our friends, is that we can use the portfolio of the energy posture that I described, as well as national security topics, and engage with them at a very different level and in a much stronger level. And from their point of view, and I would argue probably much more positive than when we were a price taker, and the kind of instability and the military aspects that kind of came from that. The next one is OECD countries, right? The broad democratic countries. It's a very diverse group. Some produce energy like Saudi Arabia, but most are big importers like Japan and South Korea, and obviously the European countries. Our ability to engage with them on the portfolio of energy is by incredibly better position than before. And to a large degree, we're not doing that on that portfolio. We were talking about LNG this or nuclear that. But for us to talk more broadly across a portfolio of energy and what we can provide to Japan or to South Korea or Germany, which is obviously in a very dramatic situation right now, how we deal with car policies. We have a much a bigger strength, and our value in the United States of power and energy diplomacy strength is it's more than 1 + 1 = 2. You add up all the different strengths, it adds up to more than 1 + 1 = 2, because the overlapping and the ability to kind of cross-cut different things. Clearly, energy technologies and environmental diplomacy, the U.S. is very much a leader in these topics, and how we engage with that in the world is obviously very different, and a longer discussion, but just to give you the intro. The emerging markets, a whole nother area. How do we deal with the countries that are dramatically increasing energy usage? And whether, what's the mix of, LNG or oil or renewables deployment? This is a very long topic. India in particular, right, is a big topic of this. Africa is going to be the most populous kind of group of countries by far, versus India and China in the not so distant future. So, and its energy consumption is very low. So just getting up to even close to U.S. standards or European standards would be a dramatic energy increase for Africa. Global mining and critical mineral policy needs, I would argue, needs to be a lot stronger. People talk about it all the time, but the U.S. has tremendous value in engaging with countries like Chile and Peru and others who are, not particularly excited about having communist China as a dominant processor of its metals. They'd rather be doing it themselves. The U.S. can actually start taking action on these with countries that are clearly allies and friends on many different topics. And there's obviously an active adversary aspect. This is a longer topic, but use the strength on Russia topics, Venezuela topics, and Iran topics has been done before. It's kind of being done now, certainly on Russia. But there's a lot more power here with our active adversaries. Communist China is a very, very large importer of energy. It's trying to build out renewables, but it's actually growing coal massively. And it's importing more energy of both LNG and oil and energy technology topics, which is a longer discussion that I help run as undersecretary. And then the very last one, in terms of energy diplomacies, how does the U.S. enhance the use of both the domestic and the multilateral financial institutions? The U.S. to a large degree kind of dropped a lot of support for export finance for a period of time. That could be reinvigorated for export of U.S. manufacturing and construction facilities around the world. And then multilateral financial institutions, in particular the World Bank, that to some reasonable degree has been captured by Communist China, and that even though the U.S. is the largest shareholder as well as the other OECD countries, that Communist China has a disproportionate amount of multilateral financing for its equipment and its exports, even though they are a much more minor shareholder. So there's strength there for not only the U.S. but for the other OECD countries. So Azmat, that's the last slide here, and certainly glad to take comments and questions. Sorry.